I'm sorry. I thought this place was empty. I have nowhere else to go." Her voice trembled in the dim lamplight snow clinging to her lashes. Caleb Mercer had returned from a day's labor in the bitter Dakota wind to find footprints in his cabin and a stranger by his stove. A woman alone stranded in the middle of a blizzard with eyes that looked like they'd run out of safe places. Follow my story until the end and leave a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The wind had been screaming all day, scraping against the frozen plains like a knife on bone. Caleb Mercer leaned into it, his shoulders hunched beneath a heavy wool coat, leather gloves stiff from the cold. The old pipeline to the horse trough had burst again overnight, another reminder that the Dakota Territory had no mercy for a man living alone. By the time he reached the shadow of his log cabin, dusk had swallowed the horizon. A thin ribbon of chimney smoke curled upward, faint and lazy in the darkening sky. Caleb adjusted the oil lamp in his hand, the cold biting through his coat, and stepped up onto the porch. That's when he saw them footprints, small, uneven, pressed into the thin layer of snow on his porch and leading straight through his front door. He froze. It had been 3 winters since anyone but him crossed that threshold. His gut tightened. He shifted the lamp to his left hand and reached for the rifle hanging just inside the doorway. The metal was ice cold against his palm. The cabin was dim shadows pooled in the corners. Only the faint orange glow of embers lit the room. Caleb stepped inside, slowly scanning the space. Then he saw movement, slight trembling near the stove. "Who's there?" His voice was low, steady, but his thumb rested near the hammer. A pause. Then a voice small and breaking at the edges. "I'm sorry. I thought this place was empty. I have nowhere else to go." The woman stood half in shadow, her skirts caked with frozen mud hair hanging damp around her pale face. Breath misted in front of her lips. Her hands were raw and red from the cold. She couldn't have been more than 25. Caleb's rifle didn't lower right away. He studied her, how she shifted her weight toward the door, as though she'd run if he made her. Then something in him, something he thought the winters had frozen solid, shifted. He set the rifle back on its rack. "Storm's not letting up," he said finally. "You can stay the night." Her eyes widened. She gave a short nod but said nothing more. Caleb crossed to the cupboard, pulling down a heavy wool blanket. He draped it over her shoulders, the coarse fabric swallowing her small frame. Her hands clutched it, as if afraid it might vanish. "You warm enough to drink tea?" he asked. She nodded again, eyes flicking to the steaming kettle on the stove. Caleb poured the last of the boiled water into a chipped enamel cup, sliding it toward her across the table. She sat quickly, both hands wrapping the cup like it was the only warm thing in the world. For a while neither spoke. The wind rattled the shutters, and the fire hissed as it caught on new wood. Caleb pulled off his coat and hung it on the chair opposite her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila. Lila Rowan." Her voice was barely above the hum of the wind. "Where are you from, Kansas City?" she said. "I was supposed to meet someone in Bitter Hollow. He didn't come." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "Guess I wasn't the one he wanted after all." Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before women left to fend for themselves in a land that didn't care whether they froze or starved. "You walk far." "Since yesterday," she admitted. "Saw your chimney smoke at dusk." Caleb set another log on the fire. "Eat?" he asked simply. A hint of relief flickered in her eyes. "Yes, please." He brought salted pork from the shelf, cornmeal from the jar, and set to cooking. Lila rose to help without being told, fetching the skillet slicing parsley from the small jar by the window. Her movements were slow but careful, like a woman who'd worked kitchens before. When the food was ready, they ate without hurry, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. Afterward, Caleb pushed the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You can take the bench by the fire," he said. "It'll keep you warm." She hesitated, then sank onto the low wooden bench, curling beneath the blanket. Her breathing slowed, lashes lowering over tired eyes. "Thank you," she murmured, almost too soft to hear. Caleb only nodded, settling into his chair. The fire's glow washed the room in gold and shadow. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, for the first time in years, Caleb's cabin wasn't empty. And he found he didn't mind. The storm didn't ease by morning. It pressed against the walls of Caleb's cabin like a living thing, wind sliding under the eaves with a low, restless moan. Snowflakes as fine as sifted flour whirled past the frosted window. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a tired glow over the worn floorboards. Caleb was already awake, sitting in his chair with one arm draped over his knee, watching the woman on the bench. Lila had curled into the wool blanket during the night, her breathing deep and even. In sleep, her face looked softer, the sharp tension in her jaw gone. But her hands, one curled beneath her cheek, the other resting above the blanket, were cracked and raw, small scars showing white against reddened skin. They were the hands of someone who had worked hard and been left to fend for herself. Caleb stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped out into the cold to tend the horse. His boots crunched into snow that had drifted halfway up the fence rails. The mule huffed clouds into the freezing air as he broke the ice in the water trough and poured in a bucket from the well. When he returned, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something warm. Lila was at the small table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, scrubbing last night's tin plates in the wash basin. Her hair, now dry, was tied back with a strip of faded ribbon. She looked up when the door shut behind him. "I hope you don't mind," she said quietly. "Thought it best to earn my keep." He hung his coat by the door, shaking the frost from his hair. "Suppose if you break something, it's yours to fix," he said, his voice dry, but without heat. The corners of her mouth tugged upward before she bent back to her work. Caleb poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove. "Coffee'll be ready in a bit." Without turning, she asked, "Do you have a needle and thread in the wooden box by the fireplace?" She found it, threaded the needle, and sat near the window to mend one of his flannel shirts. Her stitches were small and precise. Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups and set one beside her without a word. She glanced up briefly, murmured a thank you, then returned to her work. They drank in silence until he asked, "Who sent for you?" Her hands paused mid-stitch. "I don't know his name. The letter came to my boarding house in Kansas City from the Denver agency. Said there was a man in Bitter Hollow needing a wife. I signed the agreement, boarded the coach, and when I stepped off, no one came. The station clerk told me if I hurried, I could catch a wagon heading north." She tied off the thread eyes still fixed on the shirt. "I suppose I wasn't what he wanted." Caleb frowned into his cup. "You said you were a nurse during the war in Virginia. Afterward, there was little left. My father died of fever 2 winters ago. My mother, she never made it to spring. The agency was all I had left to try." The wind rattled the shutters, a hollow sound that seemed to carry her words farther than either of them liked. Caleb rose, pulled his coat back on, and stepped toward the door. When he opened it, the wind rushed in, stinging their cheeks. "You going out?" she asked. "Was going to take you to the church in town. Let Reverend Whitaker sort this out." He glanced toward the yard where snow had swallowed half the fence posts. "We're not going anywhere today?" Her eyes lowered. "I understand." That evening, the cold deepened until the walls themselves seemed to creak. Caleb reached into the back cupboard and pulled out a small tin box. Inside was a carefully wrapped bundle of dried morel mushrooms, something he'd gathered from the northern ridges and saved untouched for 3 years. Lila noticed her brow furrowing. "Those are rare." He nodded once, dropping them into the soup pot. "Saved them for the coldest day." Her voice was hesitant. "Is today the coldest?" He stirred the pot slowly. "Maybe not. But it's the first day someone else has sat at this table since she died." Lila's hand stilled on the table. She didn't press for more. When the soup was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls and passed one to her. The smell was earthy and rich, and when she tasted it, her eyes fluttered closed briefly, as though letting the warmth sink all the way in. Outside, snow slid from the roof with a muffled thud, but inside, the air was thick with quiet understanding. The days blurred together after that. The snow kept falling, trapping them in the cabin. Caleb kept to his routine, splitting wood, salting meat, boiling water. But now there was always a second cup at the table, a second pair of boots drying by the hearth. Sometimes when she thought he wasn't listening, Lila hummed softly while she worked. On the second evening, he noticed a raw, blistered patch along the back of his hand from carrying wood in the cold. Before he could say anything, she was kneeling beside him, pulling a tin of balm from her small travel bag. "You should have said something," she murmured, smoothing the salve over his skin with careful fingers. I've had worse. I know, she said quietly. I have too. She wrapped his hand in linen and tied it gently before returning to her corner without another word. Later, when she dozed off near the fire, he pushed her chair closer to the hearth and poured the last of the pine tea into her cup, leaving his own empty. She noticed, but said nothing, just curled her fingers around the cup and nodded once. That night, they lingered by the fire longer than usual, neither willing to be the one to say it was time to sleep. The wind pressed against the windows, the fire crackled low, and for the first time in years, Caleb felt the cold ease not from the stove, but from something in the quiet between them. Morning came pale and cold, the kind of winter light that seemed to drain the color from the world. Caleb rose before the fire had burned down to embers, pulling on his boots and shrugging into his coat. Lila was still asleep, curled beneath the wool blanket, her hair spilling over the edge of the bench. For a moment he hesitated, watching the slow rise and fall of her shoulders before stepping outside. The snow was deeper than yesterday, drifted high against the porch rails. He cleared a narrow path to the woodpile, the crunch of each step sharp in the frozen air. By the time he returned, his gloves were stiff with frost. Inside, Lila was awake, kneeling by the stove with her sleeves rolled up, coaxing the fire back to life. "You've done this before," he said, setting the logs down. She looked over her shoulder. "Keeping a fire going?" He nodded. "Learned it during the war," she replied softly. "Hospitals were always cold. Sometimes the only way to keep a patient alive was to keep the room warm, even if it meant tearing up floorboards." He crouched beside her, setting a log onto the flames. "That's a hard thing to carry." Her gaze flicked to him, then away. "There are harder things." The kettle began to hiss, breaking the silence. Caleb poured them both coffee. They sat at the table, steam curling between them. He wanted to ask more about the war, about the fiancée she'd mentioned in passing, but he knew the kind of wounds that stayed raw when prodded. Instead, he said, "I'll need to check the barn roof today. Snow's heavy enough to bring it down if we don't clear it." "I can help," she offered. He studied her for a beat. "You've got enough to do in here." "I'm not afraid of work, Caleb." Her voice was steady, not defiant, and he found himself almost smiling. "We'll see." By mid-morning, the two of them were side by side in the barn, shoveling snow from the roof in short, cautious bursts. Lila's cheeks were flushed from the cold, her breath hanging in the air like small clouds. She didn't complain once, even when the wind cut like a blade through the open door. When they came back inside, her hands were trembling from the cold. Without thinking, Caleb reached for them, wrapping her fingers in his own calloused palms to warm them. She stiffened at first, then let out a breath she'd been holding. "Better?" he asked. "Better," she said, her voice almost a whisper. That afternoon, while Caleb was splitting kindling, Lila moved quietly through the cabin, sweeping the floor with a damp cloth to catch the dust. She paused at the mantel where a weathered photograph sat Caleb younger, standing beside a woman with auburn hair and a smile that seemed to tilt at the edges. "She was beautiful," Lila said softly. Caleb stopped mid-swing, the axe head buried in the log. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "Scarlet fever took her 2 winters back." Lila's hand hovered near the frame, not touching it. "I'm sorry." He nodded once, as if that was all there was to say, and returned to the woodpile. But later, when he came inside, he noticed something on the mantel. Beside the photo sat a folded paper snowflake, its edges slightly yellowed, the delicate cutouts forming crooked stars and arrows. "What's that?" he asked. Lila didn't look up from the table where she was slicing dried apples. "It was the last thing my fiancé sent me before Gettysburg. He wrote, 'I'll make you 100 more when I return.' He never did." Caleb stepped closer, studying the snowflake. "I was at Gettysburg," he said after a long pause. "Second day left flank. Lost 3 ribs and a piece of my hearing there." She looked at him, then her eyes searching his face. "A lot of men left pieces of themselves in that place, and a lot never came back at all," he said quietly. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire popped in the grate, the wind whispered against the walls, and something in the air shifted an unspoken recognition that they were not strangers to loss. The snow kept them in the cabin for another 2 days. The rhythm between them settled into something unhurried, meals shared without ceremony, chores divided without needing to ask. Caleb found himself listening for her humming when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, he caught her studying him the way he'd studied her that first night, as if trying to memorize the lines of his face. On the morning the storm finally broke, sunlight spilled across the frozen land, dazzling and harsh after days of gray. Caleb hitched the mule to the sled, loading a bundle of blankets in the back. "Where are we going?" Lila asked, fastening her coat. "Town," he said. "Figured Reverend Whitaker should know you're here." She didn't argue. They rode in silence, the sled creaking over packed snow, the wind sharp against their faces. When the church came into view, a squat white building with frost crusted on the windows. Caleb tied off the mule and led her inside. The warmth hit first, then the stillness. A few women sat knitting near the back, their eyes lifting to watch the newcomers. Reverend Whitaker, a stout man with a crooked collar, stepped down the aisle when Caleb called his name. "We need to find a place for her," Caleb said. "Mail order bride abandoned up north. She's no trouble." The Reverend pulled a heavy book from under his arm, flipping through pages. "Name Lila Rowan," she said quietly. "No record," he muttered. "No husband signed for her. No payment registered. She's not legally wed." "I never said I was—" Lila replied, her voice steady but low. From the pews, someone whispered just loud enough to carry. "She's one of the rejects. You can always tell." Another voice answered sharper. "Came all this way just to get passed around." Lila's breath hitched. She turned toward the door, shame burning in her cheeks. Caleb's jaw worked silently, but he didn't move yet. She pushed the door open, stepping into the thin sunlight, her arms wrapped tight around herself. "I'm not who you think I am," she said without looking at him. Caleb's voice was quiet but certain. "I know exactly who you are. You came out of the snow and into my kitchen. You sewed my sleeve. You boiled my tea. You never asked for anything but space to breathe." She looked up at him, then snow catching in her lashes. "I brought you here to be claimed," he said, his voice even. "Didn't know it would be by me." The wind curled sharp around them, carrying the smell of pine and cold iron from the church's bell tower. Lila's gaze stayed locked on the snow-packed ground, but Caleb didn't look away from her. His gloveless hand reached out, resting gently on her shoulder, not to hold her in place, but to make sure she felt the weight of his words. "You do now," he said simply. Her eyes lifted, searching his face, as if looking for a crack in the truth he'd just given her. Whatever she saw there made her chest rise and fall in one long, steady breath. She nodded once. They turned together, walking down the wooden steps toward the mule and sled. The murmurs from inside the church followed them out, muffled by the heavy doors. Caleb untied the reins, helping Lila climb into the back. She settled into the blanket without protest, this time her hands clutching the edge of it as he climbed up front. The ride back was quieter than the journey in, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet. The air between them felt taut, carrying something unspoken, but no longer uncertain. Snow flurries danced across the open fields, catching on Lila's dark hair, turning it to silver in the pale light. Caleb glanced back at her once, but she was looking at the horizon. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down from the sled. She didn't pull her hand away until her boots touched the packed snow. Inside the fire was still warm, the scent of pine logs heavy in the air. Lila removed her coat and hung it on the peg beside his, the simple act looking almost like a claim. He went to stack more wood by the stove. "You hungry?" She nodded. "I can make something." "You cooked last night," he said. "Sit, I'll handle it." Her lips curved faintly, but she didn't argue. She moved to the table, folding the blanket over the back of a chair. Caleb busied himself with the skillet frying salted pork with a handful of potatoes he'd been saving. The scent filled the cabin, and for a while the only sound was the sizzle from the stove. When he set the plates down, she looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You cook better than I expected." He smirked faintly. "Living alone will teach you a few things." They ate without hurry, passing the bread between them. When they'd finished, Lila stood to clear the plates, but Caleb stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Leave it. I'll take care of it." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she returned to her seat. "You're different," she said after a moment. He glanced at her. "Different how most men I've met out here. They take what they can, from people from the land. You don't." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "Maybe I already lost too much to think that way." The fire popped softly. Lila's gaze dropped to the table, tracing the worn grain of the wood with her fingertips. "I'm not clean, Caleb. Not untouched. I'm not whole," he replied. "Not unchanged. Her head lifted, her eyes meeting his. There was no pity in his tone, only certainty. It held her still like the sound of snow falling in a forest. That night, after she'd curled into the bench by the fire, Caleb sat in his chair longer than usual, the lamplight throwing shadows up the walls. He found himself remembering the first time he'd walked into this cabin alone after Margaret had gone, the way the silence had felt like an enemy. Now, the silence had changed. It was full, not empty. By morning, the wind had eased, leaving the land wrapped in a brittle stillness. Caleb was out front repairing a loose shutter when he heard the distant crunch of wheels on frozen ground. He turned to see a black wagon cresting the ridge, its frame heavy and square, the kind used for hauling freight or collecting debts. It rolled into the clearing and stopped in front of the porch. The driver climbed down, a tall man in a long tan coat, the brim of his hat shadowing a face lined more by calculation than weather. A ledger bulged from the inside pocket of his coat, and silver buckles gleamed on his boots. Lila stepped out onto the porch, drying her hands on a cloth. When she saw him, her face went pale, the cloth slipping from her fingers. "Royce?" she whispered. The man grinned as if they were old friends. "Well, well, you made yourself cozy." Without waiting for an invitation, he strode past Caleb and pushed the cabin door open. Caleb followed him in the air tightening in his chest. Royce reached into his coat and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "Mail order contract, signed and paid. This woman belongs to me." He waved the document like it was a badge of authority. "You've got my property, Mercer." Lila's breath caught audibly. Caleb's jaw flexed, but he said nothing yet. Royce stepped closer, smirking. "What's the matter?" "Hiding my goods." Caleb stood between them. "She's not goods." Royce shoved him hard. Caleb staggered back a step, caught himself, and in one fluid motion his fist connected with Royce's jaw. The crack of bone was loud in the small cabin. Royce stumbled into the table, one hand going to his face. Outside, the sound had drawn a few neighbors to the fence line. They stood silently watching. Royce straightened his mouth, curling into a sneer. "You all see this," he called toward the open door. "I paid for her, fair and legal." Caleb didn't look away from him. He crossed the room, crouched by the loose floorboard near the hearth, and pulled out a small leather pouch. He placed it in Royce's hand. "That's what you paid, plus more. Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Royce glanced inside. The weight of it told him the truth. It was more than fair. He opened his mouth to speak, but Caleb stepped forward, voice low and cold. "Leave. And next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." Royce's eyes flicked from the pouch in his hand to Caleb's face, as if weighing whether to push the moment further. The murmur of the onlookers outside carried faintly through the open door, the cold air seeping in around them. For a long second, no one moved. Then Royce's lip curled more in wounded pride than in anger. He closed his fingers around the pouch and stepped back toward the door. "You think this changes anything?" he said, voice low and sharp. "It changes everything," Caleb answered. Royce hesitated, perhaps expecting Caleb to waver, but when none came, he turned on his heel. He pushed past the threshold into the brittle daylight, the crunch of his boots on the frozen ground sounding harsher than the wind. The black wagon groaned under his weight as he climbed back in his hands, snapping the reins. Snow sprayed under the wheels as it rolled away, swallowed by the tree line. Inside the cabin, the air seemed to expand in the sudden quiet. Caleb closed the door, the latch clicking into place with a finality that felt heavier than wood on metal. Lila stood near the stove, her hands clenched in the folds of her skirt, eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes," he replied simply, meeting her gaze. "I did." Her lips parted as if to argue, but the words never came. Instead, she let out a long breath and turned toward the fire, as though needing its warmth to steady herself. Caleb watched her for a moment, then stepped forward, laying a gentle hand on her arm. "You're safe here," he said. She didn't look at him, but her hand shifted slightly, just enough for her fingers to graze his. That was all the answer he needed. From outside, the muffled sound of boots on snow approached. Caleb opened the door to find Mrs. Ellery, the old widow from down the valley, standing with a small bundle in her hands. Her scarf was frayed, her cheeks wind-burned, but her eyes were bright with something unspoken. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul too," she said, holding out the bundle. Inside was a loaf of hard bread wrapped in linen and still faintly warm. Caleb took it with a nod, but before he could speak, Mrs. Ellery was already turning back toward the path, her boots crunching softly as she disappeared into the white. He shut the door again, setting the bread on the table. Lila's gaze followed it, and for the first time since Royce had arrived, a small, cautious smile touched her lips. That evening, the cabin felt different, not just warmer, but fuller. Caleb prepared a simple stew, and they ate it with the widow's bread. The quiet between them no longer heavy, but companionable. When the bowls were empty, Lila moved to clear them, but Caleb shook his head. "Leave it. Sit with me." She hesitated, then crossed to the hearth, settling into the chair opposite him. The firelight caught the strands of her hair, turning them to copper where the glow touched. For a while they sat without speaking, the crackle of the fire the only sound. Finally she said, "No one's ever stood up for me like that." Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then they should have." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "Why did you—" He considered that for a long moment. "Because you walked into my home out of the snow and made it feel less empty." The words hung in the air, their weight settling in the small space between them. Lila's breath caught, and she turned slightly toward the fire, but not before he saw the way her lips trembled. The days that followed passed in a quieter rhythm. The snow began to melt in patches, the ground beneath showing dark and damp. Caleb worked on repairing the corral fence, while Lila tended to small things around the cabin, mending torn blankets, organizing the shelves, scrubbing the floor, until the wood shone. One morning she appeared at the door with her sleeves rolled and a determined look in her eyes. "Teach me how to split wood." He raised a brow. "It's not light work." "I can handle it," she said. He studied her for a moment, then handed her the axe. Her grip was tentative at first, but he stepped behind her, adjusting her stance, guiding her hands. The first few swings were clumsy, the blade glancing off the logs, but she didn't give up. When she finally split one clean through, she turned to him with a spark in her eyes. "Not bad," he said, and meant it. The afternoons were warmer now, the air carrying the faint scent of pine sap instead of frost. One evening, Caleb returned from checking the fence to find Lila baking cornbread. The smell filled the cabin, rich and comforting. She tore the first piece in half, handing him one without hesitation. "My mother made it every Sunday," she said softly. "Haven't made it in years." He took a bite, the crisp crust giving way to a warm, soft center. "Best I've had since—" He stopped the rest of the sentence, lingering unspoken, but she seemed to understand. Later that night they sat by the fire, the cornbread cooling on the table, Clara's soft knock sounding at the door. The little orphan girl from town stood there, shawl wrapped tight, holding an empty tin bucket. "Mr. Mercer," she said shyly. "I don't have any wood. Could I have some?" Before Caleb could answer, Lila knelt, offering her a piece of still warm cornbread. Clara's eyes lit up as she took it, nibbling quickly. Caleb fetched a small bundle of kindling and a few split logs, placing them in her bucket. "Take this tonight," he told her. "Come back tomorrow if you need more." Clara nodded, clutching the bucket and cornbread, and slipped back into the cold. When the door closed, Lila leaned against it for a moment, her breath catching. "You didn't have to—" "I don't want you handling hunger alone," Caleb interrupted gently. She didn't answer, but the look she gave him held something warmer than words. That night, after she'd settled near the stove, Caleb took a small wooden board and with a heated poker burned words into its dark grain. "This cabin is no longer a place of silence." He set it against the wall near her bedroll. She stirred, but didn't wake. He stood there a long moment, the firelight painting her face in golden shadow, before finally turning away. The morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of cold that seemed to etch every branch and fence post in glass. Sunlight spilled across the snowdrifts, dazzling and hard, but inside the cabin the fire had burned steady through the night. Lila was already up, standing on the porch, with her sleeves rolled, pinning damp laundry to a rope stretched between two cedar posts. The fabric stiffened almost instantly in the air, but she moved with quiet focus, cheeks pink from the cold. Caleb watched her from inside as he sanded a length of pine near the hearth. The rasp of the tool and the faint scent of resin filled the room. It was the sort of morning that felt almost ordinary until the sound of hooves on packed snow carried from the ridge. Slow, deliberate, not the hurried gait of a neighbor. Lila straightened, a clothespin paused in her fingers. A black wagon appeared at the edge of the clearing, its frame too polished for the rough country drawn by a pair of matched bays. It rolled to a stop in front of the porch. The driver's door opened and a man stepped down tall with a long tan coat and boots that gleamed with silver buckles. The color drained from Lila's face, her hands lowered to her sides, the clothespin falling into the snow. "Royce," she whispered. He smiled as though savoring a private joke. "Well, I'll be damned. You made yourself cozy." Without asking, he mounted the steps and pushed past her into the cabin. Caleb looked up from his work, setting the pine aside slowly. His gaze tracked the man as he crossed the room, pulling a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Mail order contract," Royce announced, shaking it open like a banner. "Signed and paid. That makes her mine." Lila's breath came faster, her back pressed to the wall. Caleb rose to his full height, positioning himself between them. "She's not yours." Royce's grin thinned. "You hiding my goods?" "Mercer." "Not goods." Caleb set his voice steady. Royce stepped closer, close enough that Caleb could smell the faint, sharp tang of cologne. Something imported. Something that didn't belong here. He shoved Caleb hard. The impact forced him back a step, but before Royce could speak again, Caleb's fist connected with his jaw. The sound of it cracked in the small room. Royce staggered, catching himself on the table. Outside, a handful of neighbors who had followed the wagon now stood at the fence line, their faces pale against the winter light. Royce straightened, lifting the paper high for all to see. "You hear me? Paid for her. Fair and legal." Caleb didn't answer. Instead, he crossed to the loose floorboard near the hearth and knelt, prying it up with the ease of habit. From the space beneath, he drew a worn leather pouch, thick and heavy. He set it in Royce's palm. "That's what you paid. Plus more," Caleb said, his voice cold enough to frost the air. "Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Royce glanced inside. The weight told him the truth. It was more than fair. He opened his mouth, but Caleb stepped forward, his presence filling the space. "Leave. And next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." The words seemed to root Royce in place for a heartbeat. Then he backed toward the door, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Lila, as though searching for some sign of doubt. Finding none, he stepped outside. The crowd didn't cheer or speak. They simply parted to let him pass. He climbed into the wagon, snapping the reins without another word, and the horses carried him back toward the trees until the sound of wheels on snow faded into silence. Caleb shut the door and turned to find Lila still near the wall, her hands pressed to her skirt. Her eyes shone not with fear now, but with something harder to name. "You didn't have to," she began. "Yes," he interrupted quietly. "I did." For a moment she only stood there, the firelight brushing gold across her hair. Then she nodded, the smallest movement, but enough to bridge the space between them. Later, as the sun dipped low, Mrs. Ellery appeared at the door. The old widow's scarf was frayed, her boots crusted with frost, but her gaze was sharp. In her hands was a loaf of bread wrapped in linen. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul too," she said, pressing it into Lila's hands before turning away. That night they ate the bread with a simple stew. Lila moved about the kitchen with a lighter step, though she didn't speak of Royce again. When the bowls were washed and the fire banked, Caleb sat by the hearth watching the flames shift and settle. Across from him, Lila stitched a tear in a quilt, the rhythmic pull of thread filling the silence. At one point she looked up, her eyes catching his. "No one's ever done that for me," she said. "They should have," he replied. The fire popped and she returned to her stitching, but her lips curved just enough for him to notice. The wind outside carried the scent of coming snow, but inside the cabin the air held something warmer, something neither of them was ready to name, but both had already claimed. The days after Royce's departure carried a strange stillness, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Snow still lay deep in the shaded hollows, but the edges of the drifts had begun to slump under the weak pull of the sun. Caleb worked outside most mornings, mending the corral fence and checking the barn roof for sagging beams. Inside, Lila moved through the cabin with a quiet assurance, her hands learning the placement of every tool, every jar, every threadbare scrap worth saving. It was on one of those mornings, with the air crisp and the light stretched thin across the valley, that she appeared at the door while Caleb was sharpening the axe. Her sleeves were rolled, her hair tied back with a strip of faded cloth. "Teach me," she said. He looked up from the grindstone. Teach you what? How to split wood. Caleb arched a brow. It's not light work. I'm not afraid of work. There was no bravado in her tone, only fact. He studied her a moment longer, then rose, handing her the axe. Her grip was hesitant, so he stepped behind her, adjusting her stance, guiding her hands along the worn handle. Let the weight do most of it, he murmured. Don't fight the swing. The first few strikes glanced off the blade, biting shallow, but she didn't curse, didn't throw the axe aside. Her jaw set, she tried again. When the log finally split clean in two, she turned to him with a breathless, almost startled smile. Not bad, he said, allowing the corner of his mouth to lift. The afternoon light stretched long shadows across the snow, and when they came back inside, the smell of baking drifted from the stove. Lila had started cornbread, the golden batter hissing where it met the hot skillet. My mother made it every Sunday, she said as she worked. We'd eat it with honey if we were lucky, or just butter when we weren't. Caleb took a seat at the table, watching the way she moved in the small kitchen space. Haven't had it since Margaret, he admitted quietly. Lila glanced at him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes, but said nothing more. When the bread was ready, she tore the first piece in half and handed him one. The crust crackled, the inside soft and warm. They ate in companionable silence, and for a while the cabin felt untouched by the harshness beyond its walls. But the moment shifted when a soft knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to find Clara, the little orphan girl from town, clutching an empty tin bucket and wearing a shawl too thin for the weather. Mr. Mercer, she said shyly. Don't have any wood left. Could I have some? Before Caleb could answer, Lila stepped forward, kneeling to meet the girl's eyes. She placed a generous slice of cornbread into Clara's hands. The child's eyes widened, and she took a quick bite as though afraid it might vanish. Caleb fetched a bundle of kindling and a few split logs, setting them carefully into the bucket. Take this tonight, he told her. Come back tomorrow if you need more. Clara nodded, her cheeks pink from the cold, and hurried off into the fading light. When the door closed, Lila leaned against it for a moment, her breath catching. You didn't have to. I don't want you handling hunger alone, Caleb said softly. Her eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them before she moved back to the table. That night, after she'd settled near the stove, Caleb pulled a small wooden board from the shelf. With a heated poker, he burned words into the grain. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. He set it against the wall near her bedroll. She stirred but didn't wake the firelight washing over her face. The next morning dawned with a thin mist rising from the snow. Caleb was outside tending to the mule when he heard her humming from inside, the sound faint but warm. When he returned, she was standing at the table with a folded paper in her hands. What's that? He asked. She laid it flat, revealing a delicate snowflake cut from yellowed paper. It was the last thing my fiancé sent me before Gettysburg, she said quietly. He promised to make me 100 more when he returned. He never did. Caleb stared at the intricate cutouts, his fingers brushing the edge. I was there, he said after a long pause. Second day, left flank. Lost 3 ribs and a piece of my hearing. She looked at him. Her expression unreadable, then gently placed the snowflake on the mantel beside Margaret's photograph, not replacing it, but letting it stand there as if in shared company. Neither spoke of it further, but that evening, as the fire burned low and the wind rattled the shutters, Caleb added 2 extra logs to the hearth. Not for the warmth, but because some silences deserved guarding. The snow began to give way under the weight of late winter sun, crusting in the morning, softening by afternoon. In the yard, patches of frozen earth showed through like old scars. Caleb spent his days repairing the fence line and checking the pasture gates, while Lila turned her attention to the cabin itself, mending blankets, scrubbing the floors, until the boards shone, sorting through jars of preserved food to see what would last until spring. It was a rhythm that settled over them without discussion. She had learned where he kept the flour and the lard which mugs held. Heat the longest, which places in the walls leaked cold air, no matter how many times he sealed them. And he had learned the sound of her presence, the sweep of a broom, the hum she carried into her work, the quiet pause when she was thinking. One morning, while they shared coffee at the table, Caleb glanced at her hands. The knuckles were still chapped from the cold, but the tension in her fingers had eased since that first night. Storm's past, he said almost casually. Road to town's clear enough now. She looked up, her eyes unreadable. You mean, you're taking me back, I mean, he replied. If you want to go, you can. Her gaze dropped to the rim of her cup. And if I don't? He didn't answer right away, just took a slow sip before setting his mug down. Then you stay. They let the matter rest there, the fire popping softly in the hearth. By mid-morning, Caleb had the mule hitched to the sled. Lila bundled herself in a wool coat and scarf, her gloved hands holding tight to the side rail as they moved along the rutted, icy road. Neither spoke much. The landscape stretched pale and endless in every direction, the sky a washed-out blue. The town appeared just after midday, smoke rising from chimneys, dogs nosing at the snowbanks, the sound of boots on packed snow echoing between the buildings. Caleb steered the mule toward the small white church on the edge of town. Its windows were rimed with frost, the bell tower casting a long shadow across the yard. Inside, the air was warmer, but edged with that particular hush that only churches seemed to hold. A few women sat knitting in the back pews, their eyes lifting as the door closed behind the newcomers. Reverend Whitaker emerged from a side door, a stout man with a crooked collar and a book tucked under one arm. We need to find a place for her, Caleb said without preamble. Mail-order bride abandoned up north. She's no trouble. The Reverend squinted at Lila. Name Lila Rowan, she said quietly. He set the book on a nearby table, flipping through the pages. No record, he muttered. No husband signed for her. No payment registered. She's not legally wed. I never said I was? Lila replied, her voice low but steady. A whisper rose from the pews, just loud enough to carry. One of the rejects. You can always tell. Another voice followed sharper. Came all this way just to get passed around. Lila's shoulders stiffened. Her eyes flicked toward the door, shame flushing her cheeks. She turned and started walking. Caleb's jaw clenched, but he didn't move until he was outside with her, the thin sunlight catching in her hair. I'm not who you think I am, she said, arms crossed against the cold. Caleb's voice was steady. I know exactly who you are. You came out of the snow and into my kitchen. You sewed my sleeve, you boiled my tea. You never asked for anything but a place to breathe. She stopped looking up at him. And you brought me here to be claimed. He nodded once. Didn't know it would be by me. The wind curled around them, carrying the faint chime of the church bell. For a moment they stood there, neither willing to move first. Then Caleb stepped forward, his gloveless hand resting lightly on her shoulder. You have somewhere to go now, he said. Her eyes searched his face, the lines worn by years of wind and loss, and something in her seemed to settle. She didn't argue when he led her back to the sled. The ride home was quiet but not strained. Snow flurries drifted in the air, catching on her lashes. Caleb kept his eyes on the road, but every so often he felt her gaze on him as if she were memorizing the shape of his profile. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down, his hand lingering around hers for a breath longer than needed. Inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a living thing. She hung her coat beside his on the peg, the two garments brushing lightly together. Caleb went to add wood to the stove. You hungry? I can make something, she offered. You cooked yesterday, he said, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Sit. I'll handle it. She obeyed, her fingers twisting together in her lap as the smell of sizzling pork filled the air. When he set the plates down, she met his eyes. You cook better than I expected. Living alone'll teach you, he replied. They ate, and when she reached for the dishes afterward, he shook his head. Leave it. Sit a while longer. Her gaze lingered on him. You're different. Different how most men I've met out here take what they can. You don't. His eyes held hers for a long moment. Maybe I've already lost too much to think that way. She didn't respond, but her hand stilled, and in the soft space that followed, something unspoken settled between them, as real and solid as the log walls surrounding them. The days lengthened just enough for the sun to linger past supper, laying long gold bands across the snow outside the cabin. The air carried the faint scent of thawing earth, but the night still bit with winter's teeth. Caleb found himself watching Lila more often in those quiet evenings, how she brushed stray crumbs from the table, how her fingers curled around a coffee cup as if drawing warmth into herself. There was a steadiness to her now, a kind of calm that hadn't been there when she first stepped into his home. It was that same calm that made what came next all the sharper. The sound of hooves reached them first, slow, deliberate echoing off the frozen ground. Caleb set down the plane he'd been using on a pine board and looked toward the window. A black wagon emerged from the edge of the trees, its lacquered sides catching what little light the afternoon offered. Lila was on the porch shaking crumbs from a cloth when she saw it. The color drained from her face. Her hands stilled mid-motion. "It's him," she whispered. The wagon rolled to a stop in the clearing, the horses stamping at the snow. A tall man stepped down, dressed in a tan coat too clean for a place like this. Silver buckles gleamed on his boots, and a folded paper protruded from the inside pocket. "Royce Hale," Lila said under her breath, the name tasting like something she'd meant to forget. He grinned, a slow, deliberate curl of the mouth. "Well, if it isn't my bride making herself cozy." Without a word to either of them, he mounted the steps and pushed past her into the cabin. Caleb straightened from where he'd been leaning against the table, his eyes narrowing. "You've got business here." Royce pulled the paper from his coat and held it up like a badge. "Mail order contract, signed and paid. That makes her mine." Lila flinched but didn't move from the doorway. Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not yours." Royce smirked, stepping closer until the air between them seemed to grow colder. "You hiding my property?" "Mercer?" "Not property," Caleb said evenly, "and not yours." The smirk hardened. "I paid good money. You think you can just—" He shoved Caleb hard. The shove barely moved him before Caleb's fist shot forward, connecting with Royce's jaw in a sharp, satisfying crack. Royce staggered back into the table, one hand flying to his face. Outside, the noise had drawn a few neighbors from down the road. They stood at the edge of the yard, watching without stepping forward. Royce straightened, raising the paper for the crowd to see. "You hear me? Paid for her fair and legal." Caleb didn't so much as glance at the paper. Instead, he walked to the hearth, crouched, and lifted the loose floorboard with a practiced motion. From the hollow space beneath, he drew a leather pouch worn soft at the seams. He crossed the room and dropped it into Royce's hand. The weight of it made Royce's eyes flicker. "That's what you paid," Caleb said. "And more. Now she owes you nothing, and I owe her everything." Royce opened the pouch, his fingers sifting through silver coins and folded bills. It was more than the contract was worth, and they both knew it. "You think this ends it?" he asked, voice low. Caleb stepped closer, his voice like cold iron. "It ends here. And next time you put a price on a woman's life, make sure you can afford the man who loves her." Something in Royce's expression shifted. Anger, maybe shame, but he didn't reply. He backed toward the door, his eyes lingering on Lila as if expecting her to speak. She didn't. The crowd outside parted without a word as he climbed into the wagon. The horses stamped the wheels, groaned, and soon the sound of his departure faded into the trees. Caleb closed the door and turned to find Lila still standing by the stove. Her hands clenched together. Her breathing was uneven, but her eyes were steady when they met his. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. "I did." Her lips pressed together, not in disapproval, but in something like understanding. She moved to the table, her hands brushing the wood as if grounding herself. A knock came, then gentler this time. Mrs. Ellery stood in the doorway, her scarf pulled tight around her head, a small bundle in her hands. "Looks like someone finally bought back his soul," she said, placing the bundle on the table. Inside was a loaf of hard bread still faintly warm. Lila touched the linen wrapping as if it might vanish, and when she looked up, there was the smallest cautious smile. That night, the bread was eaten with a simple stew. Caleb noticed Lila's shoulders had eased, though she still moved with that measured grace she carried into everything. After the dishes were set aside, he found her sitting by the hearth, the firelight playing across her face. "No one's ever stood up for me like that," she said after a long silence. "They should have." He answered. The fire popped and she lowered her gaze, but not before he saw the faint glimmer in her eyes. Outside, the cold pressed against the walls, but inside, something warmer had begun to take root. The morning after Royce's departure was unnervingly still. No hoofbeats in the distance, no voices on the wind, only the muffled creak of snow shifting under its own weight. Caleb stepped outside early, the sky washed in pale blue, his breath curling into the cold. The mule stood quiet by the fence, steam rising from its flanks, and for the first time in days he felt the air around the cabin unclench. Inside, Lila was kneeling by the hearth, coaxing the fire to a stronger burn. She glanced over her shoulder as he came in, brushing ash from her skirt. "The woodpile's low," she said. "I'll take care of it," he replied, hanging his coat on the peg. "You've done enough lately." Her brow furrowed slightly, but she said nothing, moving instead to the table where she began measuring flour into a bowl. The simple act, the quiet rhythm of her hands, made the space feel less like a refuge and more like a home. They worked separately through the morning, Caleb outside splitting logs while Lila baked. The smell of fresh bread met him as soon as he stepped back inside. She was leaning over the table, slicing the warm loaf, the steam curling up into the cool cabin air. "Mrs. Ellery's bread didn't last long," she said, offering him a piece. He took it, biting into the soft center. "Yours is better," he said simply. That earned him the faintest smile before she turned back to her work. By midday, the sun had warmed the snow just enough to make the yard slick underfoot. Caleb was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door when he heard the light, quick crunch of smaller footsteps behind him. He turned to see Clara, the orphan girl, her shawl pulled tight, a flush on her cheeks. "I brought back the bucket," she said, holding it out. Caleb took it, nodding. "You need more wood." "Not today," she said, glancing toward the cabin. "Miss Lila said she might teach me to sew if I come by." He gestured toward the porch. "Go on then, she's inside." Clara darted toward the door, her boots kicking up small sprays of slush. When Caleb followed a little later, he found the girl perched at the table, clumsily threading a needle, while Lila guided her hands. The sight caught him off guard. Lila's head bent close to Clara's, the two of them murmuring softly, the sunlight falling warm over their shoulders. When Clara left, she carried a neatly mended scrap of cloth in her pocket and a small bundle of cornbread wrapped in linen. Caleb closed the door behind her, turning to find Lila gathering up the sewing kit. "She's quick to learn," Lila said. "You're good with her," Caleb replied. She shrugged. "I know what it is to need someone's patience." That night after supper, Caleb sat by the hearth with a cup of coffee, while Lila worked at the table, the lamplight tracing the lines of her face. At one point, she glanced up, catching his gaze. What she asked, half smiling. He shook his head, just thinking how it's been a long time since this place felt like more than walls and a roof. Her eyes softened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she set her work aside and moved to the chair opposite him. They sat in silence, the fire between them, the air thick with unspoken things. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of damp earth from the lowlands. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was close enough to imagine. Caleb wondered, as he watched her in the flickering light, what would happen when the thaw came, if she'd decide to stay, or if the road would pull her away. Lila must have read something of that thought in his face, because she said quietly, "I meant what I said in town. I'm not who they think I am, but I'm also not leaving unless you send me away." He set his cup down, the ceramic ringing softly against the table. "Then you're not leaving." Her shoulders eased at that, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw the tension in her eyes give way to something else, trust, fragile but real. They stayed by the fire until the embers glowed low, the quiet stretching between them like a promise neither was ready to put into words. The next morning dawned with a thin veil of fog clinging low to the valley, softening the edges of the pines and making the world seem smaller, quieter. Caleb rose before the light had fully taken hold, moving through the cabin with the practiced stillness of a man used to keeping his own company. But now there was another rhythm woven into his mornings, the faint creak of the bench where Lila slept, the sound of her breath shifting as she woke. She sat up, rubbing her hands over her face before pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice still rough from sleep. "Always am," he replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin mugs. He set one in front of her. "Got fence rails to finish before the ground gets too soft." Lila wrapped her fingers around the cup, letting the heat seep into her hands. "I can help with breakfast before you go." "Done enough," he said, though there was no real resistance in his tone. By the time the sun had cleared the ridge, the cabin was warm with the smell of frying potatoes and biscuits browning in the oven. They ate without hurry, their conversation meandering between the day's work and small things. How the snowmelt would swell the creek, how the mule had developed a stubborn habit of turning left toward the orchard, no matter where Caleb meant to go. After breakfast, he pulled on his coat and stepped outside, the air sharp and damp in his lungs. The frost on the fence rails glittered under the pale sun, and the sound of an axe splitting wood carried faintly from the yard where he'd left yesterday's pile. But it wasn't his swing. He rounded the corner to find Lila there, her coat open at the neck. Sleeves pushed up, the axe gripped firmly in her hands. She was working at a steady pace, her breath coming in visible clouds. "You shouldn't be doing that," he said, coming up beside her. She straightened, brushing hair from her face. "Why not?" "You showed me how. It's not work for—" He stopped himself before the word "you could escape" in a way that might make her bristle. "It's hard work," he finished instead. She lifted the axe again, splitting another log cleanly down the middle. "I'm not afraid of that." He couldn't help the small smile tugging at his mouth. Clearly. They worked together for the next hour, the rhythm of the swings and the crack of the wood filling the space between them. When the pile was high enough, they carried the logs inside, stacking them neatly by the hearth. Lila brushed her hands on her skirt and moved toward the table. "I was thinking," she said as she began gathering the sewing things she'd left out the night before, "maybe I could make Clara a proper scarf. Something thicker than that scrap she's wearing." Caleb nodded. She'd like that. The mention of the girl seemed to hang in the air for a moment, carrying with it an unspoken truth they both knew what it was to be without. That afternoon, Lila worked at the table with the length of soft wool Mrs. Ellery had given her. Caleb came in from the barn to find her bent over the fabric, her brow furrowed in concentration. The scarf was a deep, warm brown, the stitches even and careful. "She'll keep that forever," he said. Lila glanced up, her expression softening. "If she wants to." They were quiet for a while, the cabin filled with the hum of the stove and the faint scratch of thread being pulled through cloth. Outside, a light snow began to fall, each flake melting on the damp ground before it could join the season's remains. As evening settled, Caleb lit the lamps, their glow casting long shadows along the walls. Lila folded the finished scarf and set it carefully into a small linen bundle. She looked at him. Then her eyes steady. "I've been thinking about what you said in town," she began. "That I never asked for anything but a place to breathe." He waited, sensing there was more. "I don't want to just breathe here," she continued. "I want to make it worth something, worth the choice you made when you told him to leave." Caleb leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on hers. "You've already done that." She shook her head. "Not enough." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, as though making a decision. "Then we start with tomorrow." She tilted her head. "Tomorrow bring Clara by. We'll see what else she needs. Maybe cut some extra wood for Mrs. Ellery, too." A smile, faint but sure, curved her mouth. "All right." They sat there a while longer, the scarf between them on the table, the fire crackling low. The snow outside thickened, tapping gently against the window panes. Caleb felt the old familiar ache of winter in his bones, but it was softened now by something warmer, something he hadn't let himself believe in for a long time. And as he watched Lila gather the scarf into her lap, her fingers brushing the fabric as if already picturing it around the girl's neck, he realized the cabin no longer felt like a place to endure the seasons. It felt like the beginning of something worth tending. The next morning broke softer than most, a thin wash of sunlight slipping through the clouds and laying pale gold across the clearing. The snow had melted back from the fence posts, leaving dark rings of thawed earth. Caleb was already outside when Lila stepped onto the porch, the bundle with Clara's scarf tucked under her arm. She paused for a moment, watching him work his steady movements as he stacked the last of the split wood, the way the breath plumed from his mouth in the cool air. "Ready?" he asked, without looking up. She nodded, and they set off together toward the path that cut through the pines to town. The snow crunched beneath their boots, the quiet broken only by the occasional caw of a distant crow. Clara's small figure appeared just past the bend, her thin shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She froze when she saw them, eyes darting between Caleb and Lila before a shy smile tugged at her lips. "I brought you something," Lila said, kneeling down. She unwrapped the bundle and held out the thick brown scarf. Clara's hands hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers brushing the soft wool as if testing whether it was real. "It's warm," Clara whispered. "Warmer than that scrap you've been wearing," Caleb added, his voice gruff but gentle. Clara wound it around her neck, the ends nearly brushing her knees. She looked up at Lila with a kind of wonder that made something tighten in Caleb's chest. Thank you, she said, and then after a moment, no one's ever made me anything before. Lila smiled, smoothing the scarf against the girl's shoulders. Now someone has. They walked her back to the edge of town where the air smelled faintly of smoke and baking bread. Mrs. Ellery was waiting near the church steps, a basket hooked over her arm. She raised an eyebrow at the scarf. "You've been busy," she said to Lila. "Just keeping the girl from freezing," Lila replied. Mrs. Ellery's gaze softened. "There's more to it than that." Caleb left them talking while he crossed the street to the mercantile for supplies. When he returned, Lila was still listening to the widow, her expression quiet but attentive. They parted with a promise to bring wood to her place before the next freeze. The walk back to the cabin felt easier. Somehow, the air lighter. Lila carried a small paper bag from the store flour, a bit of sugar, and a tin of tea leaves. "I thought maybe we could have something better than pine tea for once," she said, with a sidelong glance. "I won't argue," Caleb replied. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the cabin was warm with the scent of baking. The kettle sang on the stove and the new tea filled the mugs with steam richer than anything they'd had in months. They ate biscuits with a little honey Mrs. Ellery had sent, the sweetness lingering on their tongues. After supper, Caleb leaned back in his chair watching Lila clear the table. "You've done more for this place in a few weeks than I managed in years," he said. She paused, her hand still on the plates. "It's not just the place, Caleb. It's you." He met her gaze, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "Maybe. But you gave me reason to try again." She set the dishes down, moving to sit opposite him at the hearth. The silence between them was steady, now, not fragile. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a sound that had once made the cabin feel lonelier but now seemed almost like company. "I never thought I'd stay anywhere," she admitted, her voice low. "Not after everything. I was always moving, always waiting for someone to tell me to go." "No one's telling you that here," he said. Her lips curved faintly. "I know." The fire settled into a deep, steady glow, shadows painting the walls. Caleb reached for another log, but she stopped him with a touch to his hand. "Leave it," she said. "It's warm enough." They sat there until the kettle hissed again, until the night folded in around them. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt the weight of the season shift, not because winter was ending, but because the silence in his life had been replaced with something that would last far longer than the snow. When he finally rose to bank the fire for the night, he glanced at the small wooden board he'd placed near her bedroll weeks ago. The words he'd burned into it were still clear in the lamplight. This cabin is no longer a place of silence. It wasn't just a promise anymore. It was the truth.